before the interstate highways, before plastic dashboards and touch screens, before cars became appliances, there was a time when an automobile felt like a promise. For many Americans, especially those who lived through the post-war years, a car was more than transportation. It was freedom after sacrifice, proof that hard work meant something, a symbol that the future would be better than the past. And in that world, Detroit was not just an industry, it was a belief. The factories hummed day and night, steel moved like blood through the city, entire towns measured time by shift whistles and paydays, and every car that rolled off those lines carried not just parts, but pride. Yet not all of those dreams survived. Some Brents fought bravely, intelligently, even beautifully, and still lost. This is not a story about the winners. This is a story about the cars that said goodbye and the people who believed in them. Because if you lived through those years, you don't remember these cars by specifications, you remember how they felt. Let's begin with a name that once stood for confidence after chaos: Kaiser. Henry J. Kaiser didn't come from the car business. He came from building ships during war, where deadlines were absolute and failure was not an option. When peace returned, he believed America needed something new, not bigger fins or louder engines, but smarter thinking. The Kaiser Manhattan wasn't trying to shout, it was trying to reassure. Its design was clean, its cabin was bright, and the wraparound windshield felt modern in a hopeful way, like aviation brought down to the street. For many buyers, especially veterans starting families, it felt honest. Under the hood, Kaiser didn't follow the crowd. While V8 South became status symbols, Kaiser stayed with a 6-cylinder engine, refined, efficient, and later quietly supercharged to keep up. But pride doesn't always pay bills. Every Manhattan cost too much to build. Kaiser didn't have the vast supplier networks or economies of scale that the giants enjoyed. Each sale felt less like profit and more like survival, and one year, the numbers simply stopped adding up. When Kaiser left the American market, it didn't feel like a collapse. It felt like someone turning off the lights after everyone had gone home. Then there was a car built not from necessity, but from perfectionism. The Continental Mark II. This wasn't a car for the masses. It was an answer to a question no one dared ask: what if money didn't matter? Each Mark II was assembled with almost obsessive care, panels aligned by hand, interiors stitched with patience, engines tuned for silence rather than drama. People who saw one in the 1950s didn't talk about horsepower. They talked about how solid it felt when the door closed. But perfection has a cost. The price was staggering, and worse, the company lost money on every single one sold. In a business driven by volume, the Mark II was a contradiction, too refined for its own survival. When production ended, it wasn't relief that followed, it was regret. Now consider Packard. For those who remember, Packard once meant something special. It was the car doctors bought when they made it, the car you trusted to get you home quietly and comfortably, without fuss. By the late 1950s, that world had changed. Packard no longer stood alone. It shared bodies, parts, and compromises. The Packard Hawk arrived not as a declaration, but as a final attempt. It had power, real power, a supercharged V8 that surged with unmistakable authority. On the highway, it could still remind you what American torque felt like. But it wore borrowed clothes. Underneath, it was no longer fully Packard, and people could tell. Not because the car was bad, but because the soul felt conflicted. When the Packard name disappeared from American-built cars, many didn't even notice at first, but years later, they felt the absence. Hudson tells a different story. Hudson engineers didn't chase fashion, they chased physics. Their step-down design lowered the car's center of gravity, making it corner better, ride smoother, and feel planted in a way few American cars did at the time. On the racetrack, Hudson didn't just compete, it embarrassed bigger names. Those victories mattered, especially to workers who watched their hometown brands stand tall. But brilliance can be expensive, Every styling update required major structural changes. While competitors refreshed designs yearly with ease, Hudson struggled to keep pace visually, even while remaining mechanically superior. Buyers stopped looking, not because the car failed, but because it aged honestly. Eventually, Hudson merged, and something essential was lost, not just a company, but an approach. DeSoto once lived in the middle ground, aspirational but reachable, a brand for people climbing the ladder, not standing at the top. Its adventure model wore bold styling, powerful engines, and optimism shaped like tailfins. It looked forward, it believed in progress. But markets tightened, recessions arrived, and Chrysler's own lineup began stepping on itself. DeSoto wasn't defeated by rivals, it was squeezed out by confusion. When the name vanished, it didn't make headlines, it simply stopped being printed. And then there was Edsel. No story from this era carries more emotional weight. Edsel was not born small, it was born surrounded by research, confidence, and certainty. Ford believed it could predict desire itself. The car was powerful, comfortable, technically advanced. Features like push-button shifting hinted at a future that hadn't arrived yet. But expectations became its enemy. The advertising promised revolution. The reality delivered imperfection, and the public, once disappointed, did not forgive easily. Edsel didn't fail quietly, it failed publicly. For many workers, it wasn't embarrassment they felt. It was heartbreak, years of effort erased almost overnight. Looking back now, something becomes clear. These cars didn't disappear because they lacked quality. They disappeared because the world around them changed faster than they could. Accounting overtook engineering. Scale defeated craftsmanship, and patience vanished. Today, these once forgotten cars are treasured, not for how many were sold, but for what they stood for. They remind us of a time when Detroit dared to try, when identity mattered, when a car could be imperfect, ambitious, and still worthy of respect. If you ever rode in one of these cars, if you remember the smell of the interior, the sound of the door closing, the way the road felt beneath you, then you already understand why their stories still matter. Because some machines don't disappear, they simply wait to be remembered. And if we keep telling these stories, they never truly leave.